a hairless scalp of skin from a Himalayan monastery, passed hand to hand under lamplight, sold to the world as proof, until a laboratory named the animal it really came from. A cast of a footprint in Californian mud. A woman covered head to toe in dark hair, caught alive in an Abkhazian village and kept there for the rest of her life. Different mountains, different centuries, no roads between them. And the same figure keeps stepping out of the trees, 2 to 3 meters tall, dark-furred, upright, almost a face you would recognize. Aboriginal storytellers never met Tibetan monks. A Roman, writing in the year 77, had never heard of Australia. By the end of this, you will know exactly what the bones, the hair, and the DNA tests actually said, and why the tidy answer scientists reached is not the one that closes the question. Let us start where the trail is widest. A Roman naturalist named Pliny the Elder, writing in the year 77, sat somewhere in the Bay of Naples with reports gathered from soldiers, merchants, and provincial governors spread across his desk, and set down an account of a creature seen in India. A being that walked on 2 legs, covered in hair, moving through forest cover like a man who had never learned to be anything else. He had never left Italy to check it himself. He wrote it as testimony, one entry among thousands in a work cataloging the natural world as the empire understood it. He had no way of knowing that, on a continent his maps did not include, storytellers among Aboriginal peoples were describing the same walking shape to their children, around fires he would never see the smoke of. He had no way of knowing that centuries later, trackers in mountains he had never heard named would describe it again, in languages that did not exist yet. That is the shape of the problem. Not one strange sighting, but 4, scattered across 4 continents, told by people who shared no ships, no trade roads, no written word between them. A being 2 to 3 meters tall, dark hair covering the body, walking upright, not on 4 legs like the animals hunters actually knew. A face close enough to human that witnesses reach for human words to describe it, then stop themselves because the words do not quite fit. Picture the ordinary version of this first, before it turns strange. A hunter in a forest, checking a line of traps at dusk, nothing on his mind but the cold and the weight of his pack. A shepherd on a mountain trail, counting goats before the light goes. A fisherman by a Caucasus riverbank, half listening to his own footsteps. None of them are looking for a mystery. They are doing the last ordinary task of the day. And then something crosses the tree line that should not be there, moves the way nothing they hunt moves, and is gone before the mind finishes deciding what it saw. That is how nearly every one of these accounts begins. In every place they are recorded, from the record Pliny the Elder set down to the testimonies gathered in the 20th century. Not drama, interruption. Here is a fair question to sit with for a moment. If these were separate inventions, separate frightened minds filling in gaps with the same monster by pure coincidence, why does the coincidence hold so precisely? Why 2 to 3 meters, and not one telling it as a giant the size of a house, another as barely taller than a man? Why dark hair, in cultures that had no shared bestiary, no shared church, no shared campfire? By the end of this investigation, you will have 4 case files in front of you, one from each continent, and a 5th piece, a genetic study run in 2014 by a geneticist named Brian Sykes, testing hair samples against a database no witness in any of these stories ever had access to. We will come back to what his results actually showed, because the answer is not the clean dismissal it is usually sold as. The record does not stay confined to Pliny's era or to India. The same figure turns up in the mountain passes of Asia, in the outback scrub of Australia, in the timber country of North America, told by people who never read his account and never needed to. Layer the descriptions over each other, and the edges line up too well for the comfort of a tidy explanation. This is almost certainly no accident. Something is generating that consistency, a shared trick of human perception working the same way in every dark tree line, or a shared history no one has fully reconstructed, or something walking through those forests that has left no clean answer yet. The trail starts, as these things so often do, in the timber of the Pacific Northwest, with a mining camp, a name carved into local memory, and a night in 1924 that the men who lived through it never stopped talking about. Fred Beck never forgot the sound. 5 miners, a cabin built from cut timber near the base of a volcano, and a night when the walls took hits like someone outside was pitching stones the size of fists. That was 1924, Ape Canyon, a name the mountain still carries. Beck wrote it all down himself, years later, in his own book. And the shape of the account never changed in the retelling. They had seen something upright and covered in hair near the canyon rim that day, shot at it, and that night it came back with friends. Rocks on the roof until dawn. No blood found afterward. No bodies. Just 5 men who would not go back down that trail alone for the rest of their lives. That is one night, one camp, one name. It is not where the story starts. Before any miner carried a rifle into that canyon, indigenous nations across the continent already had this figure cataloged in their own languages, and they had it long before a single European ship reached the coast. The Choctaw called it Champé. The Lummi called it Tsemekwes. Those are 2 names out of more than 100, spoken by more than 100 separate peoples, each with their own word for the same walking shape in the trees. Not myths borrowed from each other. Nations often separated by mountain ranges and dialects that shared no roots, arriving independently at strikingly close descriptions. Here is what those descriptions hold steady on. Height, somewhere between 2 and 3 meters, taller than any man standing near it. Hair dark brown, black, sometimes with a reddish cast, covering the whole body. Shoulders wide enough that witnesses describe the outline before they describe the face. And a smell that comes up again and again in separate, unconnected accounts, decades and regions apart. Wet dog, sometimes sewage, sometimes rotting meat, arriving on the air a moment before anything is seen. Cold air carries scent further than warm air does. Hunters will tell you that. Maybe that is why so many of these accounts start with the nose, not the eyes. Something else sets Sasquatch apart from a simple woods monster. Many of the nations who named it did not treat it as a predator to be hunted down. They treated it as a neighbor, a being with its own territory, its own customs, its own right to the ridgeline it kept to. You leave its ground alone, the old instruction runs, and it leaves yours alone. That is not the grammar people use for a beast. That is the grammar people use for another people. Try the simple explanation on that arrangement and see how far it carries. A bear standing upright, mistaken in poor light, fear doing the rest of the work. It covers a startled glance in the dusk. It does not cover a documented relationship, tracked across 100 languages, built on territory and etiquette rather than terror. It does not cover Fred Beck's cabin, stones landing with enough force to crack the boards, 5 armed men refusing to return. The bear theory answers the question nobody who lived through Ape Canyon was actually asking. 3 moments carry this case from folklore into a filed record, and the record does not stop at Beck's book. 1958. A construction worker named Jerry Crew found tracks at a logging site, cast one in plaster, and a local newspaper printed a name for what made them: Bigfoot. The word stuck to the whole continent's version of the creature from that point on. 1967. The Patterson-Gimlin footage. A few seconds of grainy film showing a dark-haired figure crossing a creek bed, walking upright, glancing back once toward the camera. Roger Patterson shot it. It remains the piece of film that will not go away, endlessly examined, and never conclusively unmasked as a costume. Never conclusively confirmed as anything else either. Consider what is actually staked on those few seconds of film. If it is fabricated, decades of serious search time were spent chasing a hoax. If it is not, something walked across that creek bed that biology has not catalogued. Whatever it is, the paper trail behind it now dwarfs the other 3 continents put together. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization holds tens of thousands of logged sighting reports, catalogued by state, by date, by circumstance. A group called the North American Wood Ape Conservancy runs actual field operations in the timber. Cameras and recorders left running through the night. A researcher named Jeff Meldrum keeps a personal collection of footprint casts, studied for the same details witnesses described a century before him. The wide stance, the flexible midfoot no boot sole would leave. And environmental DNA testing, still in preliminary stages, has come back more than once flagging primate material nobody can yet assign to a known species living in that forest. None of it closes the file. All of it means the Pacific Northwest built the thickest evidence trail of any of the 4 cases still waiting on this desk. Half a world away, on slopes where the air itself starts working against the men who climb them, British expedition members were about to write down a version of this same figure in the snow. What was already walking through the Himalayas before a single Western climber ever pointed a camera at its tracks. The picture at Ape Canyon held one shape until now. 5,500 miles east, across an ocean and a mountain range that shares no border with the Cascades, that same shape starts appearing in ledgers written in English by men who had never heard of Fred Beck. 1832. A British official named Brian Houghton Hodgson, stationed in Nepal, wrote down an account given to him by his own porters. They described a tall creature, upright, covered in dark hair, moving alone through terrain too steep for casual travel. Hodgson never saw it himself. He recorded what he was told, filed it, and moved on with his post. That single paragraph is the first Western sentence ever written about what would later carry a very different name. The name itself is a mistake. 1921, a journalist named Henry Newman took a Sherpa phrase describing tracks in the snow and translated it into English as abominable snowman. The translation was wrong. It stuck anyway. Newspapers ran with it, and the wrong word outlived the correct one by a century. Cold does something to reporting that heat never does. Above 5,000 meters, breath turns visible before it leaves the mouth. Ice crust snaps underfoot like breaking glass, and altitude thins judgment along with air. Every account from these slopes comes from witnesses already fighting their own bodies. That is not proof of hallucination. It is a variable no investigator can subtract from the record. Here is where the case earns its keep, because unlike the Pacific Northwest, the Himalayas hand over actual objects. 1951. Mountaineer Eric Shipton, on the Menlung Glacier, photographed a single footprint in snow, sharp-edged, roughly 1.5 feet long. The photograph circulated worldwide within months. No plaster cast exists. No body followed the print. Only the image, and the argument over it, which has not stopped since. 1954. The Daily Mail funded its own expedition into the same range, and came back with hair samples pulled from a monastery at Pangboche. A scientist named Frederick Wood Jones examined the strands under laboratory conditions. His conclusion ruled out every animal he could test against. It did not identify what the hair belonged to. That gap between ruled out and identified is where this whole region's mystery has lived for 70 years. Picture the room where that hair sat, under glass. Monks chanting, audible, through a stone wall, thin enough to carry sound. Incense, thick enough to catch in the throat. And a scientist from London, turning a sample under lamplight, unable to write a name on the label. 1957 into 1958. An oil money-financed search led by Tom Slick reached that same monastery. And this time, the target was bone, not hair. The Pangboche hand, kept as a relic for generations, was the prize. The actor Jimmy Stewart, of all people, smuggled fragments of it out of the country in his luggage, and those fragments went to a researcher named William Osman Hill for analysis. The result? Inconclusive. Not human, not clearly non-human either. A verdict that satisfied no one and closed nothing. Then came the scalp. Kumjung Monastery held a second relic, a peaked cap of skin and hair that villagers had venerated as belonging to no ordinary animal. Sir Edmund Hillary, the same man who had already stood on the summit of Everest, arranged for it to be tested. The finding? Cirro, a goat antelope native to those mountains. One relic down, its mystery converted into zoology. So 3 separate objects, 3 separate labs, 3 separate failures to produce a creature. That is where a simple explanation should have closed the file for good. It didn't, because the sightings did not stop when the relics fell apart. 1974, a Sherpa woman named Lakpa Domi was reportedly attacked by something in the high pastures. Her account describes a creature shorter than the towering figure of earlier legend, closer to a large ape than a giant. 1986, the climber Reinhold Messner, a man who had already summited without oxygen and had no reason to invent a story, reported his own encounter on these slopes. His conclusion, after later study, pointed to the Himalayan brown bear. 2019, an Indian Army mountaineering team released official photographs of large humanoid footprints found near the Makalu base camp. The photos went public. The debate reopened within hours. Ask yourself which of those 4 cases would survive if a single lab result ever came back positive, and hold that thought, because the pattern keeps refusing to break cleanly either way. Here is what stands on the ledger after nearly 2 centuries. Every physical relic tested from these mountains, the hair, the hand, the scalp, has been explained away in a laboratory by a bear, a cerro, or matter no scientist would commit a name to. And still, witnesses across 200 years, speaking different dialects, working different professions, soldiers and monks and mountaineers among them, keep describing the same upright shape in the snow. If you've heard this story before, in any version, write in the comments where you first heard it. What the labs kept disproving, the mountains kept resupplying. Somewhere between a mistranslated newspaper word and an army photograph 200 years later, this case never actually closed. It only moved. And on a different continent entirely, in eucalyptus forest instead of snow, colonists were about to start describing something with the exact same outline, long before anyone crossing that ocean had reason to compare notes with a Sherpa or a miner in Washington state. The eucalyptus stopped changing pitch the moment the wind dropped, and into that quiet came the phrase that started the Australian record. January 1789. A colonial account described a monstrous giant near Botany Bay, hair matted, standing upright at the edge of cleared ground. That is the first sentence Europeans ever wrote about it. it is not the first sentence anyone ever spoke about it. The Aboriginal peoples of that coast had already been telling this story for longer than anyone could measure in written years. Not one name for the creature, but more than 30, scattered across language groups that barely spoke to each other. Yahoo, Quinkin, and, most persistently, Yowie. Different words, same outline, repeated across a continent where inland deserts separated coastal clans from mountain clans, from tribes who had never seen the sea. Two elders, recorded in the 19th century, gave the detail that still unsettles anyone who reads it plainly. Bungari and Gunadu described the Yowie not as a monster living alongside their people, but as something that came before them. The first inhabitants of Australia, in their telling, predating humans of the modern kind entirely. Not a beast in the forest, a prior tenant of the land itself. That claim sits inside a framework Western investigation was never built to hold. Dreamtime does not draw the line European thought draws between the living and the spirit formed. A being can be flesh and ancestor at once, physical and outside ordinary time, without contradiction inside that framework. A folklorist looking for a zoological answer, and a folklorist looking for a purely symbolic one, both end up forcing a shape onto something that was never divided that way to begin with. Neither approach was built for this. Picture standing at the tree line where Bungari's country meets the cleared paddocks now. The bark smell of the eucalyptus thick and sharp. Cicadas cutting out all at once the way they do before something moves through undergrowth. And ask yourself what word you would even reach for if the shape stepped into the light. A monster, an ancestor, a man in a hide. The land does not hand you the category. You have to bring it yourself. 1979 gives a number to put beside the theory. Kilcoy, Queensland. Two teenagers reported a creature at the edge of the forest, close enough to describe hair, size, and a smell they could not place. No photograph, no cast, just two accounts filed with local authorities, matching each other in the details that count. Skip forward to December 2021. 3 men this time reported an encounter and later produced sketches for investigators, working independently enough that the drawings converged rather than copied. What lands on the page in these modern cases is not vague. Height well above a tall man's reach, dark hair covering the body, a smell witnesses across cases describe as similar and foul. And hands built along lines that match, point for point, the anatomy already logged 5,000 miles away in the Pacific Northwest. That last detail is the one that should stop you. Nobody in rural Queensland in 1979 was reading Fred Beck's account of Ape Canyon. Nobody sketching for police in 2021 was cross-referencing Jerry Crew's plaster casts from Washington State. And yet, the shape lines up. Here is where the case seems to close itself, and close it does, cleanly, for a while. In 1987, a researcher named Margaret Jones offered an explanation that carried real weight. Orangutans, she proposed, had been brought into the colony as exotic imports or ship's cargo during the 18th and 19th centuries, escaped or released, and gave colonists something genuinely ape-shaped to mistake for a monster in the bush. She paired that with a second, more literary strand, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, with its own hairy wild man figures, was already circulating in the colony and could easily have shaped what a frightened settler thought he saw. The argument has real strength, and it deserves to be taken on its own terms rather than dismissed. An escaped or abandoned exotic animal explains a hairy upright shape glimpsed once at dusk far better than any speculative hominid does. a widely read novel, explains why colonists reached for a specific vocabulary of monstrousness rather than inventing one from nothing. Put the two together, and you have a tidy account. Fiction supplied the frame, an imported ape supplied the flesh, and the colony did the rest. For the 1789 account alone, that case is hard to argue against. It cannot survive contact with the older record. Bungari and Gonedu were not describing something shaped by a novel. Their accounts, and the Aboriginal oral traditions behind more than 30 regional names, predate any European ship reaching that coast, let alone any orangutan being carried aboard one. No orangutan walked Australian soil before colonization. No copy of Gulliver's Travels existed in an oral tradition thousands of years old. The Sydney Morning Herald, reporting on the skeptical case built by Jones, noted the same gap without resolving it. An explanation built entirely from 18th century colonial material cannot account for a description that existed before the colonists arrived. So the file does not close. It stops. What is left standing in the record is this. European settlers wrote down a name in 1789 for something Aboriginal peoples had already named more than 30 times over, in a framework their own language had no equivalent for, describing an anatomy that 1979 witnesses and 2021 witnesses would later sketch in matching detail without ever comparing notes with each other or with anyone in Washington state. The orangutan theory answers one sighting. It does not answer the pattern underneath it. And running under both, coastal tradition and inland tradition alike, is a fear that never made it into Margaret Jones's account at all. Parents in the bush told children not to wander too far from camp because the Yowie took the ones who strayed. That same fear, almost word for word, shows up on the other side of the Pacific. In the missing persons pattern investigators in North America have since given its own name, Missing 411. What a hairy shape in Queensland scrub has in common with a vanishing in a national forest 2 continents away is not a question this part can answer. What it can do is point at the next name on the ledger, waiting in mountains far colder than anything in this story so far. Boris Porshnev. The mountains Boris Porshnev walked into were colder than anything in this story so far, and quieter in a way that matters. No cicadas, no eucalyptus bark, just wind moving over scree at the edge of the Tian Shan, and silence thick enough that a Soviet academic could hear his own boots on frozen ground for an hour before a single herder spoke to him. Here is the fact that breaks the shape you have been building since North America and Nepal and Queensland. The Almas is not a giant. Witnesses across the Caucasus, the Pamirs, and Mongolia describe something closer to a primitive human than an ape. Roughly 1.5 to 2 meters tall. Dark hair over the body, yes, but a sloping forehead and a heavy jaw sit on a frame built like a man, not like something that swung down from a tree line. Sasquatch is described as ape-like and immense. The Yeti carries the same bulk in the reports Eric Shipton and William Osman Hill argued over. The Almas breaks that pattern outright, and reports going back to the 15th century, the era of Tamerlane, describe this thing wearing clothing, using tools, raiding cultivated fields. That is not a beast avoiding the edge of the forest. That is something closer to a neighbor nobody wanted to claim. Porshnev took that discrepancy seriously enough to organize a state expedition under the Soviet Academy of Sciences in the 1950s, sending researchers into the Tian Shan, the Pamirs, and Mongolia to collect testimony directly from herders and villagers who had never spoken to each other. The result sits in a Moscow library archive now. 400 pages of collected accounts, gathered independently across a region larger than most countries in Western Europe. Now picture the smaller case folded inside that larger one, because this is where the file stops being folklore and starts being a family history. The village of Tikhina, Abkhazia, the 1850s. A local prince of the Akhba family reportedly captured a woman covered head to foot in hair, standing close to 2 meters, and brought her back to live among his household, rather than kill her. Her captors called her Zana. She did not die in a museum case or a footnote. She lived in that village for years, and she had children by local men. Sit with that for a moment. A creature out of the same reports Porshnev was collecting from terrified herders was, by every surviving account, raising sons and daughters in a Caucasian village within living memory of people whose grandchildren could still be interviewed. One of those sons, a man named Kvit, died in 1954. His skull was kept. It sits in a museum in Abkhazia today, which means Zana's case is the one point in this entire 5-part record where a claim about a wild human did not stay a story. It left something you can put under a microscope. Brian Sykes, a professor at Oxford, did exactly that between 2013 and 2015, running genetic analysis on Zana's known descendants. The result came back unambiguous on its own terms. 100% sub-Saharan African ancestry. That number should have closed the file. Instead, it split it in two, and each half deserves to be heard on its own footing, rather than stacked as a lesser and greater case. Read the DNA result straight, and the simplest account holds together without strain. Ottoman-era slave routes moved people from sub-Saharan Africa into the Caucasus for centuries before Zana was ever seen. A woman displaced that far from home, alone, unable to speak the local language, covered in hair from a condition doctors now call hypertrichosis, would look to 1850s villagers exactly like the wild figure their own Almas stories had already primed them to expect. No mystery required. A vulnerable woman, a rare medical condition, and a folklore category already sitting there, waiting to receive her. That is the version that needs the fewest new assumptions, and it is the version most consistent with everything genetics can currently confirm about human variation. But the account does not sit easy once you ask why nobody wrote down a name for her, why she was kept apart, even after years in that household. Why the sloping forehead and heavy jaw, specific to Alma's testimony, show up in descriptions of her skull structure at all, if she was simply an enslaved woman with excess body hair. A modern DNA match tells you about ancestry. It does not, on its own, explain away every detail eyewitnesses gave before anyone knew what a genetic marker was. That gap is not proof of anything. It is just a gap, and it is honest to say so rather than paper over it with the tidiness of a lab result. And running underneath both of those readings is the older evidence Porshnev never got to test with a swab, because there was no lab in the 1950s that could have told him what he was looking at. His 400 pages of testimony describe Almas sightings going back centuries before Zana was ever captured, independent of her case entirely, gathered from Tien Shan and Pamir and Mongolian communities that had no more contact with the Akhba household in Abkhazia than Queensland herders had with loggers in Washington state. To this was added a genetic reading offered by the researcher Margarian, working from the same Sykes data, arguing the ancestry result does not rule out a relict population as cleanly as it first appears to. Both readings use the identical raw numbers. Neither can currently be ruled out by those numbers alone. Whichever reading you find more convincing, remember what is actually at stake in getting it wrong. A woman lived and died inside one of these explanations, and her son's skull has sat in a museum case for 7 decades, waiting for someone to finally settle which story is true. Sykes did not set out to write a folklore chapter. He set out to run a genetics lab, publish clean results, and let the data speak for itself, the way ancestry testing had done for him on cases with far less at stake than a woman's entire identity. What he got instead was a number that satisfied the geneticist in him and left the story wide open for everyone else. Whatever he intended when he opened that sample, the moment it came back sub-Saharan African, the question stopped belonging to the mountains of Abkhazia and started belonging to him. A hairless scalp of skin still sits in that Himalayan monastery drawer where the last part left it, and the lab that named the animal it really came from never sent anyone into the Tin Shan to name the Almas the same way. That gap is the whole shape of this case now. Boris Porshnev's 400 pages of testimony are still sitting in a Moscow archive, uncontradicted, unconfirmed, and Zena's son Kvit is still a skull in an Abkhazian museum case that a genetics lab could measure but not fully explain. 3 explanations remain on the table. None of them close the file. The first is the one Jeff Meldrum has spent a career defending in his book Sasquatch and Other Wild Men. That somewhere in the unmapped folds of the Pacific Northwest, the Himalayas, the Australian outback, and the Central Asian ranges, a relict hominid population survived past the point science expected any to be left. It sounds like fantasy until you remember what turned up on the island of Flores in 2003. A hominid species roughly a meter tall, nicknamed the Hobbit, had been alive as recently as 50,000 years ago, sharing the planet with modern humans for tens of thousands of years without anyone in Europe or the Middle East knowing it existed. Henry G., an editor at the journal Nature, went on record saying the Flores find made the survival of other undiscovered hominid lines a live scientific possibility, not just a cryptozoologist's daydream. If a 3-foot hominid could hide from every anthropologist on Earth until the 21st century, the argument runs, a 9-foot one in the Cascades or the Himalayas is not automatically absurd. But look at what that theory actually needs to be true, and the weight of it becomes obvious fast. It needs breeding populations, plural, on 4 separate continents, each large enough to survive for thousands of years, each leaving no bones, no burial sites, no tools, no fossils anywhere in the record. Flores gave researchers actual skeletal remains in an actual cave. 50 years of Sasquatch searching, decades of Yeti expeditions from Eric Shipton's Menlung Glacier print to Reinhold Messner's own trek through those same mountains have given the world casts, photographs, and hair samples. Not one bone. Which is where the second theory steps in, because if the evidence never shows up, maybe the explanation was never biological to begin with. Every civilization on record seems to have needed a version of this figure long before anyone crossed an ocean to compare notes. The Sumerians had Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals on the steppe before he was drawn into the city. Medieval Europe had its own wild man of the woods, carved into church misericords and painted into manuscript margins centuries before Columbus. Loxton and Prothero, in their book Abominable Science, lay out the case that the wild man is less a species than a role every culture assigns to the edge of its own map, the thing that lives just past where the fields end and the trees start. It is a clean answer, and it is also where the pattern in this investigation stops cooperating. A cultural archetype is supposed to bend to whatever a culture needs it to say. Enkidu is a companion who becomes civilized. The European wild man is a moral warning about losing your humanity. but bend those archetypes next to what 4 separate continents actually reported, and the differences that should be everywhere start to disappear. Roughly 2 to 3 meters tall, dark hair over the whole body, walks upright like a man, not a beast on all fours. Aboriginal trackers in Queensland, who never left their own country, described the same silhouette that herders in the Pamirs described to Porshev's researchers, the same silhouette Fred Beck's mining crew described from Ape Canyon, the same silhouette British officers pulled out of monastery legend into the pages of the Daily Mail. An archetype is allowed to wander. This one keeps arriving at the identical address. Picture it plainly for a second. 4 rooms, 4 locked doors, no windows between them, and 4 separate witnesses independently drawing the same face on the same night. That is not what a myth usually does when it travels without a map. A myth mutates the way a rumor does passing through a crowd. This one arrived pressed flat, the same shape, over and over, on 4 continents that had no ships running between them, and no reason to compare stories. So the file turns to the third explanation, the one that does not need thousands of years of hidden hominids or a shared unconscious. It needs bears, misidentified corpses, and outright hoaxes. And this is the version modern genetics has actually been able to test. Brian Sykes, the same Oxford geneticist whose lab worked through Zana's descendants, ran a wider survey in 2014 for the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B. He and his team collected 30 hair samples submitted from around the world as Yeti, Sasquatch, and Almas evidence, and sequenced every one of them. Here is the number the case has been circling since Part 1. 30 samples. 28 came back as known mammals already on the books: cows, horses, raccoons, and, more than once, ordinary bears misread in poor light by someone who wanted to see something else. 2 samples from the Himalayan region did not match anything in the modern reference database. Sykes proposed they were closest to an ancient polar bear lineage, a detail that briefly suggested some unknown bear population might be walking around Himalayan slopes, generating Yeti reports on its own. 2 later researchers, Edwards and Barnett, went back over that same genetic data and found the ancient polar bear match did not hold up under closer comparison. The 2 anomalous samples most likely belonged to ordinary modern brown bears after all. 30 samples, tested to the limit of the technology, and not one came back as an unclassified primate. That result gutted a chunk of the physical evidence in this case, without gutting the mystery itself, and it is worth sitting with why. Sykes did not find a Yeti in that lab, and he also did not find nothing. He found that 30 separate physical objects, submitted in good faith by people who believed they were holding proof, were all something else. That is a real result about relics. It is not a result about testimony. And testimony is most of what this whole investigation actually runs on. Think about how thin the line is between those 2 categories the next time you glance at a security camera clip labeled Bigfoot or Yeti sighting online, half convinced by 3 seconds of grainy footage before you scroll past it and forget the feeling by dinner. None of the 3 explanations sitting on this desk accounts for all of it. Relict hominids explain the consistency and fail on the total absence of bones. Cultural archetype explains why every civilization needed the story, and fails to explain why the details refuse to drift the way archetypes drift. Misidentification and hoax explain every physical sample Sykes ever tested, and cannot explain why a Roman writing in the year 77, herders in the Pamirs, Porshnev interviewed by lamplight, Aboriginal trackers in Queensland, and loggers in Washington state all described independently the same 2 to 3 meter dark-haired figure standing upright at the tree line. If you look at the way that image keeps recurring across cultures, with no ships or roads between them, the closest reading I can offer is that the pattern itself is real, even where any single specimen turns out not to be. And I say that, fully aware it settles nothing. Somewhere in a museum case in Abkhazia, Kvit's skull is still sitting under glass, still unclaimed by either explanation. Somewhere in a drawer, 30 hair samples from Sykes's study are still catalogued as mundane. And somewhere above the tree line, wherever that line happens to run this year, wind is still moving over rock, the way it moved over the Tien Shan scree under Porshnev's boots, indifferent to which of the three files anyone chooses to believe.